Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me. This is a opportunity for me to connect with so many of you who are on the various social media sites, as well as our newsletter list, to share some of the thoughts I've been having around, what exactly are we talking about when it comes to very basic questions that right now are no longer academic, although I like to spend time to reflect on just the mystery, if you will, of life and of the various topics that I've explored through GreenMedInfo, as well as my book. And the timing of all this has been amazing, really. I just spent last weekend filming for the upcoming relaunch of Regenerate, the masterclass, because we're doing all new content. And it really got me thinking about the basic questions around viral germ theory. And as you know, I've been working with Dr. Andrew Kaufman, who's done such an incredible job of really looking at these basic questions, like, do viruses cause disease? The question itself is sort of like, are vaccines capable of causing a side effect? What I mean by that is today, in this age, it's very difficult to even ask questions of the orthodoxy, because right now it's not really functioning so much as anything beyond a form of control. And I think it's important, extremely important right now, for us to ask these basic questions again, so that we can get back to understanding what life is about. And I think, if anything, speaks to what the Great Reset is really about. It's this question, again, is what are we doing here? What are we doing with our lives right now, given what the narrative is spinning, given the economic collapse that is also happening, given the breakdown of the social fabric. And that's literal, because as everyone knows now, they're telling us that being social can cause the death of the people we love. Simply being within contact of someone is being defined as a potentially deadly act. And that is something that I never dreamed of in my life would come to pass. Yet the shadow of the world, the shadow of this moment, has always been present. And if anything, as others have pointed out, the word apocalypse is about unveiling. And it's about ultimately integration, because so what I'm talking about here is that the shadow work a lot of us are doing, it's about acknowledging that we all have our faults, we all have our unexplored blind sides or blind spots, and it's through connection and through conversation and through questioning that we come to greater integration and greater understanding, and hopefully greater compassion for one another. But it starts with ourselves. So I'm having some struggle around having compassion for those, for example, who constantly reiterate the danger of viruses, because when you really go back down to the fundamental definitions here, you'll find that even the term pathogen, it's like already semantically preloaded with meaning. The word immunization is the same. Is a vaccine and an immunization? If we assume that the word immunization is just fine and dandy, what we're saying is vaccination equates to bona fide immunity, right? Without equivocation, without exception. And that's where semantics comes in. Semantics is actually, it's very powerful in terms of how it gets us to think, feel, and act. So when we talk about viruses being pathogens, the assumption is that they have this inner agency, this intrinsic motive force that enables these little infinitesimal particles, if we can even call them that, to jump from body to body. We're attributing a lot of agency to viruses when we describe them as pathogens, when even in their most conventional definitions, through the highest gravitas scientific and health authorities on the planet, they're defined as obligate parasites. which means that they need a host, basically, right? They need a host to generate themselves, because actually they don't even exist outside of the quote infected cell. The virion architecture of influenza, for example, which was only analyzed sufficiently in 2014, shows that half of the proteins and lipids that comprise influenza come from the host cell within which it's found. I'm not going to say within which it infects, because that's already attributing agency and this penetrative ability to these particles, which, as we will discuss, there are a wide range of particles, a near infinite range of particles that have been found within cells and around cells. And that is part of the unfolding picture that, this, if you will, I'll use the term pandemic. The pandemic has revealed psychological operation. I'm saying it's all a psychological operation, not necessarily intentionally, but with the old biology, the assumption is that, they didn't understand at the time that when they were identifying these so-called viruses, that they were also mixed in with natural particles that the cells produce, which include exosomes. They are the same size, the same density, they contain the same nucleic acids. And alongside those exosomes are also apoptotic bodies, as well as other bodies that will look like viruses when applying technologies not suitable to identify viruses, such as polymerase chain reaction, which is PCR, which is being used right now, right, to confirm cases in the expanding case demic, meaning cases do not make for a instance of morbidity or mortality, right? A case is simply a reification. It's sort of like this concept that we are hammers and we're looking for nails, and whenever we use PCR, we're going to find a nail. We're not going to find a virus, because Kary Mullis, who invented PCR under the influence of LSD, as I understand, he had the vision for it, which is an interesting fact. He made it pretty clear that it's for qualitative, not quantitative assessment, and that it cannot identify specific viruses. In fact, he was one of the few outspoken scientists and technologists who said that HIV doesn't cause acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS, right? Taking AZT and other chemotherapy type medications that are designed to destroy fast replicating cells, which include lymphocytes and white blood cells, that will cause a AIDS-like spectrum of symptoms. But an invisible particle, again, invisible from the perspective of visible light, electron microscopes, for example, are able to go down to a resolution 100,000 times smaller than the visible light. So we're talking about subatomic scale resolution through an instrument never intended to really identify living things. Electron microscopes are looking at electron level phenomena, right? They're not looking at living things. They can't identify causality. They're freezing in a moment of time, something that is quasi-visible. Anyway, so Kary Mullis, of course, he was one of those people that actually questioned whether this quote retrovirus, HIV, could cause someone to die, because that is basically still an ongoing question that I think anyone at this moment in time should be asking themselves. Can viruses tackle human beings? Just literally take them down like a lion takes down a antelope, on the Serengeti. Is that possible, right? For something so infinitesimally small that it needs an instrument that uses electrons to try to see it, that this is what's happened in this moment in time, is that we believe that something that is invisible, that's just crouching, 6 foot and a centimeter away, can jump over and can tackle me. Now, I've been talking about this for some time, is the tensile strength of biological substances is really high. What we mean by that is that if you were to take, for example, collagen and steel, weight for weight, collagen is just about as strong as steel. That's one of the building blocks of the human body. There's other references you can look up yourself for the membranes of certain cell types having the tensile strength of steel as well. This is why I like to use the example of, you see these Shaolin monks, resisting being penetrated with a sharpened blade. Their skin, in the skin, you see the skin and it's resisting. This isn't necessarily theoretical. We have a resilience in our body that is capable of literally resisting steel penetrating it. Steel. And we have been made to believe, right, through the media virus, that there is this invisible particle from Wuhan that sprung up suddenly in a wet market or maybe some bioweapons facility, and that it just jumped around the world and it's waiting around the corner for us. At any moment, it could just penetrate our helpless, fragile, selves. And this is what they want us to believe, because this is, of course, the new world order, which is predicated, as Giorgio Agamben said, on setting up a preparedness sort of mindset against worst case scenarios in terms of infectious disease, where it's low probability but extremely high impact. It's like what happened after 9/11, right? For 20 years, we had to hear about how a terrorist could be crouching behind the corner, and we had to suspend all of our civil liberties so that they could protect us against this potential inevitability. Well, that's what is happening now, and there are people like Giorgio Agamben who've been standing up and communicating how clearly this is a new situation like 9/11, and that we have erected around us a global biosecurity state. And I've talked about it before, but within this viewpoint, any sovereign nation's soil can be invaded, like the Bush era preemptive war doctrine, under the auspices of saving someone's life. Doesn't even have to be the people in that country, right? It's the world now. We need to protect the world against these particles that only they know how to scry with their instruments. So obviously you get it, you're here. And so what I want to do is go deeper down that rabbit hole. So let's go back to what a virus is. It's an obligate parasite. What that means is it doesn't have the ability to do anything without a host cell. And even the term host already implies passivity. I'm trying to get beyond that because it doesn't make sense, especially when you start looking at what the role of exosomes and viruses are in the human body. Okay, so the NIH put out this amazing lecture by Herbert Virgin, who is an incredible pioneer in the science of the human virome and understanding how viruses are actually essential for establishing the immunophenotype of all animals. What his research showed was that, for example, and this lecture is called The Mammalian Virome. You can look it up on YouTube. I've been talking about it for years because no one knows about this obscure topic apparently, but now there's 44,000 views, which I feel really good about because people need to watch this video. It will blow your mind because he points out how many of the viruses that we've been told exist simply to cause disease and to kill us, like herpes family viruses or Epstein-Barr virus, it's been found that what they do is in certain individuals, they actually activate immune responses, which fill in the genetic gaps that they may have. For example, they may have been born with low immune function, so they don't produce enough cytokines of some sort, okay? Maybe it's interleukin-6. They don't have enough of it, so they can't call in the right macrophages to help to prevent certain bacteria from growing out of their natural number and causing harm. So in some cases, having herpes virus infection prevents both deadly forms of bacterial infection. This is according to the classical view of germ theory, and which is more applicable to microbes, of course, and tumor formation. So this, quote, slow virus that is in the majority of the world's populations is there helping to overcome the reality, which is the protein coding genes in the human genome have a glacial pace of change and adaptability afforded to them. It may take hundreds of thousands of years before a nucleotide sequence shifts in a critical region of the, let's say, chromosome 6 and the HLA-DQ antigen, was it the major histocompatibility antigen class? So then what happens is a virus can actually alter the expression of that transcriptional machinery that's hard-coded, that takes hundreds of thousands of years to change, in real time, so that that animal or human can navigate its environment in real time and survive and adapt and thrive in some cases. So in other words, between genotype and phenotype, right? So everyone shares the same 3 billion nucleotides within the cells of their, within the nucleus of the cells. The expression of those different genes, okay, 23,000 around are protein coding, will vary according to the cell type. So if it's a liver cell, it's just that different genes are being expressed than a heart cell, different genes than a skin cell. So what changes the expression of the genotype is, in some cases, viruses. And that is what gives rise to the different phenotype that enables you to, if you will, dip and weave according to the different environmental factors, which include different nutritional factors, meteorological, chemical, electromagnetic. So the virome becomes this constellation. Well, I would say it's almost like a separate galaxy. I've done entire talks on this, which is that it's really about extending the genetic capability of the body. And what the virome can do, and the microbiome includes also the bacteria, as well as fungi, which is called the mycome. And you have helminths, certain parasites that also are extremely important for regulating immunity. And that entire galaxy, which includes, again, the virome, is there so that you can do amazing things, like amazing things. For example, Stephanie Seneff and I were curious. We're like, can the human body produce ascorbic acid or ascorbate? And according to the dominant view, I think it was 63 million years ago, our ancestors, which basically were complex animals that depended a lot on their food from fruit-bearing trees, lost the ability to produce vitamin C from basically glucose. So that gene doesn't work. And so even today, we're very prone to blood sugar disorders, right? Because we can't convert excess glucose into ascorbic acid. In fact, we don't produce much at all. And that was one of the key findings of Linus Pauling, which is that we don't actually suffer from excess cholesterol, for example. That's not the cause of heart disease. It's actually the inability to heal the blood vessels. When there's damage to the lining of the blood vessels, the endothelium, use collagen. And how do you produce collagen? You need vitamin C. And remember, collagen has about the tensile strength of steel. It's a very important compound. Well, in the absence of vitamin C and the collagen, what do you use? You use use LDL, lipoprotein A, as well as cholesterol. And that is used almost like a Band-Aid. But you don't blame the Band-Aid on the wound. The wound has to do more fundamentally with environmental exposures. Let's say you're smoking all day long, for example, that damages the blood vessels, and inadequate vitamin C, which fundamentally boils down to the fact that we can't produce it anymore. So it's very interesting to look at biology through that evolutionary lens. It's myopic, but it's an important lens. So the point here is that vitamin C is one of those components that we need to produce collagen. And ultimately, the virome and actually, it's really the bacteria that I studied the most. And in the book, I talk a lot about this, is that, for example, some people have the MFTHR SNP, the mutation that a lot of the functional medical folks get a little hung up on. Well, it turns out that there are strains of bacteria like Lactobacillus plantarum that produce methylated folate. So that even though your genes can't produce the enzyme required for you to produce the methylated form, you have bacteria that come in and do the job for you. So we already know about the role of so the point is that we actually have a bacteria. Seneff and I found we have a bacteria in our gut that produces vitamin C. And interestingly, that strain is also sometimes associated with sexually transmitted disease. So the point is this, is that your bacteria represent an entire galaxy, as well as your virome, of potential biosynthetic pathways that enable you to, again, dip and weave with the different changing environmental circumstances. So that if, say, your body suddenly doesn't produce enough of a inflammatory messenger, it needs to call in macrophages to clear an infection or gobble up a tumor, your body might use a virus or bacteria in order to generate those compounds. It's fascinating. I mean, you could go so deep down this rabbit hole, but the point fundamentally is when we start understanding the virome, we start understanding how absurd germ theory is, especially when applied to viral particles. For example, going back to the retrovirus HIV, what is it, 8 to 11% of our genome, the one that everyone's worshipped for decades, right? That was supposed to be the holy grail, is derived from retroviral insertions of nucleic acids into our genome, in fact, down to the germ line. So obviously, that means that retroviruses as a category can't be so bad, because we wouldn't exist if we didn't have them. In fact, the brain itself and its profound size relative to other simians is believed to be attributable to the fact that there is retroviral DNA at the root of some of that encephalization event that occurred starting 2 million years ago. The placenta wouldn't exist without retroviral insertion of what was foreign nucleic acid. So not only are viruses not harmful, we wouldn't exist as a body plan. Our blueprint wouldn't exist without the ones that they consider even the most deadly. So when you're looking at, quote, COVID, or this totally synthetic new branding, there's already 100 different coronaviruses that are naturally present in the human virome that have been identified. There's, according to the classical view, a good 7 that are circulating any normal cold season. And then you get the people that go and say, oh, yeah, well, of course they are, but this was a byproduct of weaponization. And they tried to do this gain of function tweak to it to make it, extremely deadly. That would be great, but are you also inserting little rocket packs inside these little viral particles, right? Are you putting in mitochondria, which are way bigger? You can't do that to get them to move from point A to point B in space and time. Is that how they went from Wuhan, right? They're just this passive particles, people just coughing each other's faces. And then somehow the aerosol is going to penetrate through the cell membrane. Because of course, that's how viruses work, right? It's lock and key. They have the perfect little key, little spike protein. And if you have the little lock, it's like bingo, it goes right into your defenseless body and you're just a victim. It's really quite absurd, but this is what they've convinced the world of. And it's taken them centuries to do this. And it still harkens back to the very ancient concept of these demons out there, right, that come and infect people or suck their souls. I mean, the fear of mortality is fundamentally what they have co-opted, harvested, and then weaponized against us. Only the packaging is viral germ theory. This is what they're using to take the most ancient of concerns that goes right down to the depths of your limbic system, that draws from fear, survival instincts that are pretty much subhuman. They're not even really what humans are about, which is sharing, caring, even sacrificing what is, my own goal and desire to be alive for my children, for example, or for someone that I love. I mean, what they want is fear, which is what Giorgio Agamben talks about in his books, about how they've reduced us down to the animal body. The animal body is what enabled the Nazis to put Jews in camps and kill them and exterminate them. In fact, it's interesting because that way of thinking runs really deep. If you go down the rabbit hole of the Third Reich, Hitler himself called himself the Robert Koch of politics, right? Robert Koch is the 19th century German physician who came up with this concept that, germs are the primary reason why people get sick. And at the time, he had relatively more convincing argument with bacteria. But when it comes to viruses, which they didn't even have the technology to isolate, understand, it totally breaks down, because the postulates are really important for you to understand. And we'll go back to Hitler later, because this is highly relevant to this moment. Okay, here we go. Koch postulates. And of course, Dr. Andrew Kaufman's been doing a great job in this. Okay, the postulate number one. This is the one that doesn't even work from the outset. And this is the basis for the entire superstructure of weaponized germ theory that's been applied now globally as a geopolitical weapon against every single human on this planet. Okay, that's what the pandemic, scamdemic, COVID-1984 is all about, right? Number one, okay, the microorganism must be found in abundance in all organisms suffering from the disease, but should not be found in healthy organisms. Did they ever do that? Have they ever proven this? Can you find coronavirus or exosomes, which, by the way, are indistinguishable from coronavirus, to the point where a new study came out a few days ago proposing that reinfection of those who had COVID may be caused by exosomes who now carry COVID-19 nucleic acids. So they can't even make it up. You know, it's like exosomes and coronavirus viral particles are indistinguishable on some level of analysis, especially with PCR, which again can't distinguish anything from anything. It's a joke. Curry Mullis himself even said that you could pretty much find anything with this, right? Meaning PCR isn't finding needles in haystacks. PCR is the haystack. As you amplify with each cycle the original primer nucleic acid sequence, you're going to generate a positive. It's just a matter of the cycles. The primers are the piece that people need to look at. Have they ever fundamentally isolated COVID-19 from Wuhan, especially given that Koch's postulates have never been even followed? Did they take patient zero, or the set of patients that they claim first had COVID-19, and then take out from them a microorganism called COVID-19, proving that those around them that were asymptomatic and healthy didn't also have it in their body, and then apply all the basic procedures and principles of virology to ascertain that that is what caused the disease? No, they didn't do that. So the whole thing breaks down from moment one, from the absence of even a patient zero. Number two is the microorganism must be isolated from a diseased organism and grown in pure culture. So that's what we're talking about. Did they take like the 7 patients that they say had these symptoms and then isolate from each and every one of them the COVID-19 particle? Can they prove, by the way, that that COVID-19 particle was the sole cause of their symptoms and supposed death, when there are about 1 million other variables one could look at to understand why someone might be susceptible to any symptoms of any disease? No, they didn't do any of that. Number 3, the cultured microorganism should cause disease when introduced into a healthy organism. No, they haven't done that. And they would say potentially that's unethical, but because they never did step 1 and 2, so they couldn't do step 3. Number 4, the microorganism must be re-isolated from the inoculated, diseased experimental host and identified as being identical to the original specific causative agent. They didn't do that either. As you can see, the emperor wears no clothing. I already interviewed Dr. Andrew Kaufman on this, how COVID-19 presumed pathogenicity does not obey any of the Koch postulates. They simply don't apply. So when people say COVID caused death, that is not based on science, logic, reason, biology. There's nothing you could ever do there to establish that causality of that type happened. It's just not possible, especially given what you now know, of course, about the nature of the human virome. Obviously, that is why April 20th, when the World Health Organization released their emergency ICD codes for certifying people dead from COVID, they removed all and every standard of proof for showing that anyone had a virus or that any kind of clinical, empirical evidence existed linking COVID-19 with someone's death. They literally removed it. And every single world nation that's claimed to have a COVID-19 pandemic related death did the same. They literally removed the standard for proof. They said no virus testing required. All you need to do is suspect someone has COVID-19, and then you can label it died from COVID-19. So we've all seen this. I interviewed Dr. Joy, I'm sorry, she's not a doctor, but Joy Fitz, who is a former LA County death clerk, and that's also on this YouTube channel. And it clearly shows that even if there was a standard of proof that was applied, it's just an opinion of the doctor doing the certificate or the coroner. That's just an opinion. That's all it is. There's never been an attempt to propose that this is evidence-based. So the emperor doesn't wear any clothing all the way down to the first of all, presumed realities, which is that they followed the Koch postulates in any way. So I think what's happened is in this window, people have been forced to start questioning, once again, the origin story of germ theory. And of course, it's pretty clear that another complicating factor is that, yes, exosomes now make it much more difficult to attribute inexorable lethality or pathogenicity to viral particles, or let's just call them extracellular particles, because they transfer essential information between cells, between individuals, within groups, as well as even between kingdoms of life. Meaning, when I eat an orange, guess what's inside of it? There are exosomes loaded up with these amazing particles, some of which contain nucleic acids like microRNA. MicroRNA are believed to govern the expression of the majority of the protein coding genes in my body. So I have this orange, I'm eating it, and it's putting into my body, my tissues, these nucleic acids that are altering the expression, right? The structure and function of my genome. So is that viral? Sounds kind of viral to me in the classical view, right? Well, actually, those exosomes are very similar. Now, here's one thing too about viruses. What is the difference between an exosome and a virus according to the classical definition? Well, according to the classical definition, exosomes can't replicate like viruses can, right? Because viruses are self-replicating. So what does that imply? That they have agency, that once again, they're out there looking to infect somebody. They penetrate through the cell membrane, ostensibly of a healthy person, and they start replicating. They take over the machinery of the cell, right? I think it was Palmer, right? The founder of chiropractic, that said if germ theory was correct, there'd be no one alive anymore. If their pandemic predictions and their COVID-1984 universe they want us to inhabit were true, we'd all be dead. We will all be dead very soon, according to the power they attribute to this invisible particle. So the notion of it being self-replicating goes back to, again, the power of semantics. If you believe that viruses can be described accurately as self-replicating, guess what's happened? It is the dark magician's trick of shifting agency, again, away from the human body and immune system to this invisible particle once again, because they're self-replicating, right? And they have the ability to infect us. In fact, just being exposed to someone who's asymptomatic and healthy, who's within 6 feet of me, right? That alone could be considered deadly, where I actually should be in my house with the doors closed, protecting myself and society from that inevitability that I could be exposed to this deadly particle. Is that powerful? Oh my Lord. It is amazing that this is the level that we have gone to, because this is the ultimate sorcerer's trick that we've all fallen for. In an international coup, the global, if you will call it, pharmaceutical agenda transmogrifies into this psyop, talk about spiritual warfare, that we are now being made to believe of the trillions of particles within our body, that the one that they happen to have gotten the patent on, right? Go to Plandemic by Mickey Willis, amazing documentary. They just happen to have that patent on that particle, which again, no one's probably ever isolated in the wild. It's completely a quasi-synthesized particle at best, if it even exists. That particle is that dangerous and that unique that even though we are comprised of trillions of these things, that we now have to shut down society. We have to shut down all interaction between bodies on this planet and intermediate with what happens to be, technocratic, surveillance state with their, transhumanistic vaccine. I was writing about this in 2012. And in fact, that's when I got a lot of flack because I must have hit a nerve. I wrote about the vaccine agenda being transhumanistic. And I remember I had, Respectful Insolence, ORAC, Dr. Gorski write a hit piece on me as some kind of uber quack for implying that somehow these vaccines that are using DNA, RNA technologies could be transhumanistic. I mean, come on. I mean, they're theoretical anyway. No one's ever going to produce one. It's never been approved before. They've never had an mRNA vaccine on the market before. So this is absolutely a leap of faith, right? To even consider releasing one onto the market. So that's what's going on. Transhumanism 101 is that they are proposing that and this is from Bill Gates' own blog called Bill's Notes, that you are going to take the vaccine and it is going to turn your own cells into a vaccine manufacturing plant. That's right. They're going to alter forever certain cells in your body so they can produce antigen forever. And this is somehow a controlled process. Guaranteed that is going to cause profound harm. Guaranteed it will cause the symptoms that they attribute to COVID-19 particle infection. So they'll generate a new wave, which will further justify the draconian regulations, the mandates, and that is how this agenda will continue to unfold. You just can't make this stuff up. But we need to be reminded of how absolutely absurd this concept is, that it is the invisible particle out there that determines our health destiny, when in fact we know that cells, when damaged, will produce viral particles, exosomes, apoptotic bodies, and a range of nucleic acid releasing or containing substances that on a PCR test will look very much like a positive for what they're looking for. So the cells get damaged. That's what causes disease. We know what causes disease. It's the toxicant exposures. It's non-native VMF. It's incompatible foods, right? Nutritional deficiencies, psychogenic harm, like acute and chronic stress, like what they're doing with the COVID-19 pandemic. That is what causes the cell to deteriorate, right? That is what causes it to undergo necrosis or apoptosis. That's what causes the release of the nucleic acids that then they are saying cause the harm to the cells. It's a transfer of agency. So in the responsibility-oriented model, we're responsible for our health. We're responsible for resilience because we know what causes harm. We try to remove the interference, and then we stimulate regeneration, which can be done through any number of ways, even just simply resting. And here's my other key point. What is sickness? Is it something that we should be globally terror-stricken over? Or is it the body's very way to detoxify, rest, regenerate, and heal? It's the latter in almost all cases. I'm never going to be hyperbolic and superlative and say every case, because I don't know everything. No one else does either. But in most cases, that is what illness is. You get a cold so you don't get cancer, right? You get a cold or the flu, so you detoxify. It's a heroic approach to detoxification because the body sometimes accumulates so much stress, so much toxicant burden that it doesn't have any other than this ancient way of dealing with it. In fact, in my book, I talk a lot about sickness syndrome because it helps people understand that the body, when it's stressed, needs to rest. And guess what? Most of us, including myself, we're stuck on our devices. We're stimulated by the world. We want to go eat. We want to socialize. We want to exercise. Want to have another matcha latte. We don't want to rest. We don't want to fast. We don't want to detoxify because it doesn't feel good. That's why your body engages sickness. It's so that your body can finally rest. And in fact, in the Western world, sometimes it's the only way you can get out of work so you can heal. So seasonal influenza, for example, which often happens in populations that are chronically diseased, that don't know better, that don't have the skill set or the protocols in place to know how to detoxify, and or they're deficient in basic compounds like sunlight-related vitamin D. This is well known. So in that case, we start understanding how the so-called Xenogen Hypothesis works. Now, this is a term I coined, which is simply adding in the term xeno, which sounds like foreigner, other, right? Which is what viruses are supposed to be, right? They're supposed to be other than us, and they come and infect us. And pathogen, that's what gen comes from. It means to generate. It means to give rise to give birth to. You put the two terms together, and what happens is you start to understand infection and contagion differently. Because I'm not here to say that I haven't witnessed in my life what appears to be infection and contagion, which is that someone who's close in your family gets sick, and then what happens after a certain period is that you end up having similar symptoms. So that is a very powerful fact. Most of us have some memory of this happening, some experience, and that's what ultimately feeds this narrative. Is that, yes, COVID-19 isn't just a normal infection, it's deadly. Even though, of course, we know now through the CDC's own figures that that's absolutely not true. Unless you're already sick, you're already on your deathbed, are you going to likely succumb from what they're calling COVID-19? But again, they took away the requirement to even prove that anyone died from COVID-19. Please help me, you 585 people out there. I could be just sitting here for the next 10 years reminding people that they took that away April 20th. The World Health Organization, every member nation, including the United States, they took away the requirement to prove anyone had COVID-19 for them to be labeled as a COVID death. So the Xenogen hypothesis is like this. It's like xenohormesis. What happens, right, when plants undergo cold stress? Let's say it's kale, and it's a green variety, and in the winter it starts turning red with polyphenols because it's being stressed by cold. Or drought resistance. Let's say it's a grape and it produces more resveratrol, another polyphenol that gives it resilience when times get difficult. By the way, an animal eats those things and it gets some of the same benefits for longevity and resilience. So xenohormesis is based on the principle that even a small amount of something that would be considered bad is actually helping you to generate greater resilience. So in the case of someone that's going through detoxification symptoms, like mucus just pouring from their nose, for example, it's a good example because think about it. People who consume dairy products, what happens? It activates goblet cells, for example, that produce mucus. Why? In a way to protect them from the exposure to a substance which is actually biologically incompatible for most people, other than maybe, Northern European, blonde hair, blue-eyed, light-skinned, who've had thousands of years of cow's milk in their, lineage. Generally speaking, cow's milk is actually rather toxic. Anyway, they end up with these symptoms. So your body is going through this dump of mucus, other toxicants. You have a fever. And I will thank Dr. Cowan for this because he's made a really good point, which is in his new book, The Contagion Myth, which is that when the cells are heated, the gel, which is the fourth phase of water, which comprises the body, right? Because most of our water, like I say, if you puncture your skin, you should leak out if you're 99% water by molecular number. or number of molecules, but instead you don't because you're a gel. So when you heat it, it actually enables you to liquefy some of the embedded toxicants that are there over time. They bioaccumulate in certain tissues. Like lipophilic toxicants will actually accumulate, like Teflon, for example, which happens to be a component in those blue surgical masks. They go into the fat cells and they stay there. Sometimes the half-life is something like, I think it's like 6 months for this Teflon or PFOSs. So when the heat is increased, you have a fever, you're literally able to liquefy and excrete those toxicants. So suddenly a fever isn't just about raising up your immune function so that you can handle the virus, because that's the typical explanation that, sometimes it's a nod to sort of natural ways of thinking. How about the diarrhea some people experience? That's another example. Happens with celiac disease. And by the way, a while ago, someone published a paper that proposed that you should look at gluten as a pathogen. The only difference is it doesn't replicate, right? The way, quote, viruses do. That when you overlap the characteristics of pathogens with certain chemicals, you start to realize that they're pretty much indistinguishable. This myth around viruses being self-replicating, that's when you remove that, they become the same. So let me give you a quick example, because this is part of the Xenogen Hypothesis. Okay, so celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. On GreenMedInfo, I've indexed research on over 300 adverse health effects linked to the consumption of gluten. Gluten, by the way, is a misnomer. The proteomic analysis of wheat shows there's 23,000 plus distinct proteins within wheat. They have disulfide bonds, very hard to break down. Same kind in human hair. You burn it, it smells like sulfur. Very hard to break down. We don't have the enzymes that can break it down. So guess what happens? You have bacteria in your gut that do the job for you. Problem is, some of them, like Klebsiella and Clostridium, are actually toxic and are associated with, again, situations where the immune system fails and there's an overgrowth of pathogenic bacteria. So technically, to survive the influx of gluten peptides, some of which are so toxic that they can cause your liver to fail, or your kidneys actually more specifically, that it's better for the body to use these bacteria, which themselves can cause harm over time, than to allow your body to be penetrated by a flood, a Pandora's box of undigested proteins, many of which overlap with our own cell structures, which is one reason why wheat causes autoimmune disease and a downward spiral of health. So in that circumstance, actually, it's not that different from being infected by bacteria. In fact, there is a specific 33 amino acid long peptide in the wheat proteome called 33-mer, and it is the immunotoxic sequence in pertussis pathogen, which is known as pertactin. So it's almost like you're flooding yourself with an antigen. It's an antigen adjuvant. And that's only one of 23,000 proteins. And by the way, that's why vaccines are so terrible, is that Gardasil has genetically modified yeast, which has, 3,000 proteins, a third of which overlap with the human proteome. So it's like getting 3,000 vaccines, literally, because that's how many antigens are injected in that highly toxic, ungodly thing called a Gardasil vaccine, which is one of the reasons why it's the most side effects of any vaccine ever documented. So the idea here is that what we are calling pathogen, okay, let's say a virus, may actually perform other functions. Okay, so there's at least two ways, and there's probably 20 ways of looking at this. I know this is overwhelming, but let me just go back to the original concept. I get, quote, infected, and I start engaging detoxification pathways throughout my entire body. My cells now are producing exosomes because they're actually in the microbial cloud. I don't have to sneeze, it's just around me, that actually contain information that when someone in my family, for example, is exposed to those exosomes, they actually might need that information. It's like a text information, literally, that they can then use to engage detoxification pathways within their body. And over time, that generates more resilience. That's actually similar to herd immunity, and it looks a hell of a lot like viral contagion infectivity. Do you understand? Viruses are pieces of information. They're genetic elements that are actually in search of tissue. I used to say in search of chromosomes, but now we know, again, that as mediated through the microbiome, these viruses may simply just upregulate certain post-transcriptional elements of the immune system so that you can have a certain response. So you don't actually have to go and affect the nuclear DNA to transfer this essential information. The idea, though, is viruses are pieces of information. That's why exosomes are so interesting, is that they have nucleic acids within them, including what have been called viral nucleic acids, which are essential for communicating information. So, for example, one of the most amazing studies ever performed, and it was recent, was feeding a group of Asians rice containing exosomes, which were then found to survive digestion and go into their blood and actually changing the LDL receptor function on the liver. And this is a big deal, of course, in the classical cardiological view, because it's all about lipids and cholesterol levels, and this could have profound effects on cardiovascular risk in that model. But the point is simply by eating rice, the information altered the structure and function of essential feature of their liver, not unlike a virus. But in this case, we can assume, since these foods existed for hundreds of generations, those exosomes actually become essential for their health and well-being. And that's why ancestral foods are so indispensable. If you start deviating and eating genetically modified food, which actually contains a wide range of novel new exosomes or disinformation packages, imagine what that may do to the structure and function of your genome and epigenome and those of your progeny. That's one reason why the discovery of exosomes and the real function of viruses is so profound. For example, the fact that you get uniparental inheritance of the vaginal microbiome and virome through the mother, that is a massive amount of information, a huge amount that's passed down extra chromosomally. That's why the microbiome and the virome are so important. So in the Xenogen Hypothesis, once more, viruses, okay, whether they be actual exosomes or other bodies in that range of, let's say, 300 nanometers to down to maybe 10, there's a universe of particles there, okay? To call one of them viruses and the other exosomes is actually not possible, because there's even a hypothesis around, it's known as the Trojan horse hypothesis, is that what viruses are, even HIV, is hijacked exosome pathways in the body. And exosomes originally were described as viral-like particles. So even when they first saw them, they were like, wait, are these viruses? What are they? So when we start understanding, okay, the virion architecture of influenza, this deadly thing that's a scourge upon the planet every year, which incidentally, they've had a vaccine for decades with, and it still has done nothing. It actually has, again, the host proteome and lipome as comprising the virion particle, which is what carries the supposed bad nucleic acid around. And that is actually what they attribute antigenicity and immunogenicity to, is the virion architecture. Well, when influenza infects a bird, in avian influenza, it actually has a completely different bird-derived virion architecture, or an earthworm, or whatever the heck it's infecting, a human. So the idea that it's other is absurd. Okay, it needs a cell to even exist. And then when you take it out of the cell, it's half your cells anyway. So to then attribute to it this infinite lethality, this thing that we have to shut down the entire global economy for and literally imprison people for and have them on 24/7 surveillance is completely absurd from the perspective of actual biology. You can call it the old biology that has lent these superstitions and mistruths to this agenda. But when you look at the actual science around viromes, exosomes, the way that the body actually handles immunity, none of it makes sense. So let's go back to the basics. So with the Xenogen hypothesis, what's happened now is we can understand why someone, for example, can get terribly sick from exposure to someone else who had a similar health crisis. It's like getting a text message that has information that's alarming. Look what happened to my friend. It was a couple years ago. They received a text message saying that an intercontinental ballistic missile was going to land in Hawaii in like half an hour. Imagine this friend of mine totally freaked out. They did not know what to do. And it was just a darn text message. And then it was later discovered that it was absolutely an accident. It didn't mean anything. Imagine her autonomic nervous system before and after. Well, that's what these forms of information can be. And in some people, they may get the message from that individual who's, throwing off these exosomes that it's alarming, because those signals also indicate that the environment is toxic, for example. And so what happens is their body might then start to go through a healing crisis as well. And it's like what happens with alcohol withdrawal or Klonopin withdrawal. 2 cases where you can literally die from too severe a detoxification. So who's then to say, backing up, that it was the fault of the person who was sick, who had exosomes in their, so off-gassing from their aura, or the person that, for example, didn't take good care of themselves, right? That they had never detoxified before or couldn't handle that detoxification, right? And you add in all the other exposures we go through. I mean, imagine being in an apartment in New York City right now with probably 800 different Wi-Fi signals within, a quarter mile, penetrating them 24/7. That is the cause of disease, not viral particles that are essential to your virome and your biology. That is the way that they have taken over the mind of the world, by convincing people that there's such a thing as an inexorably lethal particle that you can't even see, that people believe exists, that is why that they're allowing all of these egregious violations, taking away a parent's right to make choices over whether their children can be penetrated by a deadly medical intervention like a vaccine. That's what they're doing right now. The American Pediatrics Association and a number of lobbyists are trying to remove the parent from the equation because of the fear around something like deadly viral particles. So this is absolutely a psychological war. And I don't know how much longer I'll be able to use YouTube to say that to you, but I think it's clear, and a lot of people are waking up. And actually, I don't think we have a choice anymore, because they're not stopping at the door anymore. They're saying, if you have a family member with a fever, this is Mike Ryan, the director of emergency programming for the WHO. He said, we're going to go into your home. We're going to take that family member. That's literally what they have said is the agenda. Is there's no more liberty. There's no more independence. You don't get to make a choice around your health, around your children's health. They're laying claim to the human body. And they're saying that your body is so dangerous for existing with the microbiome that they can literally take it and put it into a confinement camp and force inject. I mean, you all know this. I don't want to get you scared about it, but this is what is happening. Which, by the way, whenever I say these things, please go to Stand for Health Freedom, become a member, donate if you want. It is a 501c4 dedicated to building, if you will, a voting bloc that is larger than has ever been seen before. I mean, we have, I think, over 200,000 people already that are subscribers that have taken an action on the platform. And we've probably had close to, I think, 700,000 actions taken. And this isn't just signing petitions. This is using a type of software that enables you to look up your elected official within seconds and send a custom message to them. That includes even video, depending on the campaign type, texting, auto tweeting. This is all set up for you so that you don't have to sit back and feel like you're powerless, because this is the moment we need to stand up, because they will continue to take advantage of our compliance and complicity. But they shouldn't be able to do it by referencing these viral particles if we are doing our job correctly. So part of that is understanding and education. So here's a great support for the Xenogen hypothesis. There was a study done where they took animals, they were mice They gave them acetaminophen, which is Tylenol, one of the top causes of liver failure and death on the planet. And they showed that it produced these exosomes, right? And cells are constantly producing exosomes all day long. When you're healthy or you're sick. So that's not a surprise. But the surprise was they took those exosomes, they put them into a healthy mouse, and it caused similar activation of liver damage. Now, it wasn't because the exosomes contained Tylenol. It was because of the information. So this is an example of where you could see a exposure to a toxicant can look a hell of a lot like a pathogen infecting someone. Those exosomes induced by Tylenol in that formerly healthy animal that's now sick, and if you looked at it, it'd probably have many of the symptoms of having sickness from a infection. You just take those exosomes, which are like viral-like particles, put them in a healthy animal, and they start to exhibit similar symptoms. Now, the specifics of why that's happening, we don't know, but let's assume Tylenol-induced activation of the detoxification pathways in the liver were then reproduced in the animal that was healthy. Because the idea here is when one animal in the herd is exposed to something, there's a benefit to the entire group if that information can be shared. Now, if the information that animal has in its genome, for example, locked into the nucleus that can never get out, can't be shared, that's not going to do anything to share that information, right? The dialogue, it needs to happen. So that's one example of how what looks like infectious particles causing disease is simply a byproduct of an animal being poisoned and then its body communicating essential information that will contribute to the survivorship of that species, theoretically, if it's transferred over. So that is one little example of where the Xenogen hypothesis might make some sense. And keep in mind, the word xenogen also connects to the word xenohormesis, right? Which is, again, the idea that being exposed to something that could be considered harmful or having symptoms of disease may actually be essential in generating resilience and regeneration. So consider that again. The moment we submit and comply with the view that fevers are deadly, that fevers are the disease, that simply having a temperature above normal means you're a threat to the world, right? Or you can't gain entry to your employment, or you can't go and get an essential service, or you're willing to submit to them taking infrared thermometer to your forehead, which eventually will be automated. They already have these kiosks. If you submit to that, you are helping to bring in this new world that is predicated on what has to be described as a pretty primitive view of what the body is and does, and what infection is and what health is. So what we're doing is we're institutionalizing our own Darwin Award, our own end of sanity as a civilization if we submit to this level of idiocy. A fever serves a fundamental function. And yes, there are febrile seizures. There are cases where people die after having prolonged fevers. I'm not saying illness doesn't exist, but to try to say that now simply having a fever, a symptom, means you're a threat to yourself or others is the problem, obviously. So once again, it's important to understand that our body need support. If you have a fever, some people actually sweat it out. They put a blanket over themselves. They take a diaphoretic like ginger. They stay hydrated and they get the fever to break. Because guess what happens? You get a new immunological set point. New homeostasis is established. That's how the body works. And by the way, by having a severe acute illness like cold and flu, for example, that is one way that people get around the inevitability of cancer. Some people are so sick they can't even throw a fever together. Do you see? So it's inverted. So the people who are sick are now being described as being healthy for civilization and society. And the people that are healthy, who actually encourage these symptoms, because they know that's how they become stronger and even pass it down to their bloodline or laterally to their bloodline. They're being targeted as the enemy of the state, of the international, sort of agenda. So this is a really interesting place to be. I didn't happen to have consciously known that natural medicine nor GreenMedInfo would be at the center of a global agenda. I mean, I kind of knew that there was something going on in that sort of ilk, but I didn't realize that it would be to this point. And that's also a good reminder that those who are on this broadcast, and there's now 650, which is great, because it's very hard to get people to connect any longer through social media, because we're getting close to the point where the sort of underlying mask is revealed, and we start to see that, yes, DARPA created the internet and social media has been vacuuming up all of our information and behavior and contacts, dossiering us out for some time. So I encourage you all to remember that GreenMedInfo is a user-only platform, and that our newsletter is basically the way that we've survived multiple attempts at deplatforming. I don't focus on this that often, but they are trying very hard to take out this message. So you can support us, become a member if you like, or just share our content, honestly, because to me, that's more important at this point. Is just get information out that's going to help people navigate this very trying time. So as it comes, let me just make sure I'm connecting all the dots here for you. So the Xenogen Hypothesis. So what I anticipate is, as we move forward, the key is going to be detaching yourself from the system. Because what's going to happen now is that they are going to, like I said, institutionalize this level of craziness and idiocy. I don't mean to be dehumanizing, but I'm just saying, like, this is like going to be AI driven, and there's going to be no human error in applying these mistakes or these intentional deviations. They're going to make it essential for you to comply in order to get access to what you would have formerly considered, your entitlement. It could be schooling, it could be getting, an order from Whole Foods. So that's going to mean, and also it's obviously going to be used to usher in the fourth industrial revolution and the restructuring of the global economic system. And that's really important to understand, because, you can't really be healthy in this day and age unless you have the resources to protect yourself. And that is going to mean that many of us are going to be challenged. If you can't get employment without a COVID test or vaccine, that is a really difficult choice that's going to have to be made. And I'm going to do whatever I can to ensure that I don't have to make a choice that puts me or my loved ones in harm's way. But I think the most important thing we can do is to be, sort of sharing community connection with those who have similar values. I've worked a lot, with my beloved wife, Kelly, to focus on sharing values and bringing people into our lives that have those values versus having the same beliefs. It helps, but oftentimes even those closest to us, we have completely different viewpoints. And when it comes to health and being in the world today, it's not academic. A good example, I'm riding my bike down the road here in Miami trying to get healthy, and there's a man with a child. They both wear masks. And I realized that, like, my path is going to be within 6 feet of them. And I preemptively, because I'm generally a considerate person, deviate to make sure they know that I'm not going to violate what I assume is their comfort zone, which is 6 feet or whatever. And what I've done in that moment is that I've further established that I am dangerous and that this is real, just by me trying to navigate around what I assume is their fear. Now, if I had stood my ground and just been like, you know what, I don't think this is real, I don't really care what they think, that guy who looked like he was pretty upset that day, he might have taken my presence within his child's 6 feet as being a threat. Like, we live in that world now. So I do feel like it really behooves us to become even more intelligent, even more sort of versed in reality. which again is hopefully some of the things I'm speaking to, which is that we might start having to have discussions with the people we interact with on a daily basis, questioning them. It's like, how do you know that's true? We might start having to really build up a certain type of psychological resiliency, and if not a keto-like skill set with the people we love and even just people in society. Yeah, I know. So anyway, I really hope that this helped. I wish I could go into more depth. What I want to do is to continue to collate together information that is going to help you to communicate in a very clear way some of these concepts. And Beverly, thank you. German New Medicine is one perspective that is actually very valuable. Oh, that's the part that I also wanted to just briefly mention, is that when people say, okay, I get your perspective, but what about all these people that actually have something, that people that are sick, that are in hospitals, that I know, like, what do I say to them? I have a friend who just died from COVID. Like, what am I going to tell them, that they're wrong and it was exosomes that, transferred beneficial information to them? Obviously, you can't do that at all times. It's, people are grieving. People are in a state of fright. So having a rational discussion with them on these topics is very difficult. But what I would point out to those who are listening is that psychogenic disease is so powerful that arguably just the belief that an invisible particle can kill me. And I don't mean that in some kind of weird new agey way, that this isn't backed by science, because for 10 years I've been talking about this study that was performed in a Swedish population, where they did a diagnosis to see if they had cancer, irregardless of whether that was an accurate diagnosis or not. When they gave them the report that they had cancer, within 1 week, they had up to 26.9-fold increased risk of heart-related death. This wasn't cancer of the heart that they had diagnosed with. They were heartbroken. They literally died from the grief over the prognosis they were given, which was usually very poor. The 26.9-fold increase group had brain cancer diagnoses, which are very, difficult, obviously, to treat. The point is that if people believe that this is real, there's nothing really you can do unless you can help them with that belief, obviously. But some people are so entrenched in it that, yes, when they go into a hospital and they're afraid and they're exposed to whatever interventions they're given, and they succumb or they almost succumb, they're going to walk away from that as a COVID survivor for the rest of their life. They're unlikely to look at how the very interventions created the morbidity and or mortality in the case of those who are surviving. So, but I know that this is true. This is now so fundamental to the new, if you will, psychobiology. I didn't get to focus that much of it in my book, but your belief is so powerful. So it is true, exactly, the nocebo effect, that your belief about COVID-19 can cause a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that is why I believe it's so important to go back to square one. Go to questioningcovid.com if you like. There's a whole section put together just on helping people navigate this question around germ theory. Just watch one of Dr. Kaufman's videos. It is so powerful, because also when you're walking around the world not afraid of viral particles and realizing that you are responsible for your immunity at the very least, and or you're going to do whatever you can to prevent obvious exposures like the rollout of 5G, for example, from causing you and the loved ones harm, and that is the focus. That is going to be extremely empowering for a moment. Okay, but all the reifications, and this is the most important point too for those who don't fully understand, but I think everyone understands at this point, a case does not mean anything. There's no symptoms involved. People are rolling up to these stations for PCR tests and they're getting confirmed cases. PCR doesn't confirm anything of value whatsoever. It has no bearing on anything related to human health or well-being. So what's happening is the media is taking every single case number, and they're using that to justify further lockdowns and an impending implosion and reconfiguration of the global economy and power structure. That is where we have to fight this on some level, because it is so egregious. This concept that if you have no symptoms and you're healthy and you had a positive PCR test, that somehow means you should do something other than question why you were gullible enough to get the test to start with. We really need to work on this together, because every single media outlet, and there's tens of thousands of them around the world, have megaphoned this, and this is the virus right now, the case-demic. And it's amazing how few people even know what that term means. When I Google it, like, no one's really looking case-demic, but we clearly are seeing the unraveling of the socioeconomic fabric of the world using this psychological operation. I hope to God that I can continue to do this work and help to provide some balance to the nonsense out there. But ultimately, it's going to be up to each and every one of us. So coming early next year is going to be the Regeneration Masterclass 2.0, where I'm focusing a lot of my energy on, again, deconstructing this in a way that's succinct and then giving you tools and skills to empower yourself. So that's a lot of what I'm focusing my energy on. And then Kelly and I also have a membership community called Vital Life Project. And that is another way that you can join sort of a intentional community of individuals, and putting more of my energy there. But I do really love doing these broadcasts, and thank you everyone who showed up. I will be looking at some of the comments. And again, if you can share this with those who you feel would benefit, that would be wonderful. And see you on our Telegram group, as well as Parler, because so many people are leaving the other social media groups. So Parler, Telegram are probably where I'm going to focus connecting outside